Welcome back to English 210. This is Ralph Waldo Emerson's sermon, Trust Yourself. Second sermon we'll be reading in the course, and Emerson delivered this sermon in 1830, 2 years before he would resign from Boston's Second Church and resign from the ministry permanently. He never ceased preaching. He continued throughout his life to serve as supply preacher, something of a substitute preacher at various services throughout the Northeast and elsewhere. And he never abandoned religion per se, but he did resign from the formal ministry in the Unitarian Church. So he delivered this sermon later again in 1837, and Emerson would return to use pieces of his sermons and revise them for use in lectures throughout his life. So he never abandoned many of the ideas that he began to lay out in these early writings. So here, let's open with the scriptural epigraph. Remember that all of Emerson's sermons follow a standard homiletic form. We have an epigraph, a passage of scripture that is then considered, and the doctrinal principles are pulled out and interpreted as Emerson would see fit, and then applied in a closing section. That is to say, thought through and used as instructions for how we might be able to live our lives in some way. So again, we have this sort of move from thinking to action that is based on consideration of a scriptural passage. So, excuse me. So let's look at this passage here. For what is a man profited if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Matthew 16:26. So we're going to be seeing in this sermon a real emphasis on the value of the soul, of one's own soul, which Emerson will at times, and not always consistently, align with the mind. The mind is very important to him. Man's ability to think is very important to him. Everything follows from it. And we're going to see more of that in this sermon, just as we did in Pray Without Ceasing. So there is a distinction set up between the material world and the spiritual or intellectual world. And again, sometimes Emerson aligns the soul and the mind, and at other times he seems to think that they're two distinct things. I don't think that he ever fully works out how he understands the two and what their exact relation is, but they do often overlap for him, partly because I think he believes that the mind is what enables us to partake of this larger soul that is for him the power in the universe, or this force in the universe that he ends up calling God. So that gets a little bit ahead of where we are, but mind kind of connects us to this larger soul, this larger force, this synonym for God that is all that is, in a certain sense, that is what includes man and nature and the spiritual realm and everything within it. If that sounds big and fuzzy, it is. And Emerson is trying to think through or imagine what it is, or give word to what he thinks this larger sort of order or shape of existence looks like. So it's a big attempt, and so it's going to be fuzzy, but that's kind of what he's trying to do. So let's go back just to briefly summarize. He's going to make a distinction between, a very important distinction between the soul and the mind, and on the other hand, the material world or the natural world. Natural is synonymous with material. It's stuff that you can see and touch and feel and so on. The spiritual or intellectual world are the invisibles, the ideas, the sort of internal thinking about principles, as we'll see in the first sentence of this sermon. So let's look to the opening line. There's a lot in this line, and we see Emerson's key terms, some of the governing terms that he will never abandon throughout his life, throughout his writings. So it reads, this is in the beginning of the sermon on page 13, all of the instructions which religion addresses to man may imply a supposition of the utmost importance, which is that every human mind is capable of receiving and acting upon these sublime principles. Okay, so if we look at this line, we begin with a comment about religion. Emerson was concerned with religious practices and religious conceptions throughout his life. Some might say that he rejected the church, rejected religion. Remember, he did leave the Unitarian Church. He did resign from the ministry, but I think it's incorrect to say that he abandoned religious thinking or abandoned any kind of concern with religious principles. And we'll see more of that later on when we get to his public lectures and his most famous essays. So of all of the instructions which religion addresses to man. So this is what religion does. It has a set of instructions that it addresses to man. And these instructions are provided to us how? By means of the scriptures, by means of the writings of the particular religious tradition. So most of the major wisdom traditions, religious traditions, have their scriptures, their words of God, however they take that God to be. So instructions which religion addresses to man, all of them. So he's generalizing here. But this is what religion does for him. This is its job. It addresses to man instructions that imply, now this is important, they imply a supposition of the utmost importance. So these instructions are offered because or while they're implying a something about what it means to be human. That is to say that every human mind, notice the word mind, not human being, not person, but mind. Every human mind is capable of receiving and acting upon these principles. So the instructions and principles are used synonymously here. Instructions provide principles. They give you the principles of the given religion, of this belief system. So, but what's important about this is that these instructions imply that the mind is capable of receiving them. That is to say, they're being addressed to you, to men. I'm using men because it's Emerson's word, but he means, or one could argue about this, but he's talking about humankind here. So the human mind, right, can understand. You can understand these principles. One can understand them. And one can also act upon them. So these two words, receiving and acting, are two steps in a process of living or a process of behaving that really never drop out of Emerson's writings, really ever. And so he may use other terms, receive, assimilate, take in, and so on, absorb, and then act, this outward movement, act, go outward, express, other synonyms that I won't use right now because out of context they sound a little bit off. But again, we receive, we take in, and we act. We put back out. So this is what we do with these principles. And this, again, never goes away. But who does it? An individual person? No, it's a person with a mind. A human mind does this. So focus on that word because he'll use it 11 times in this very short sermon. Mind and intellect, but mind especially, the word mind, very, very important. Everything follows from our ability to think. And this was absolutely primary for Emerson. It never disappears. So the foundation here is these religious instructions give us a way to understand how we should live ultimately, right? So this is how we should go about day-to-day existence, receiving and acting upon principles. So religion has a really, really important part to play, But he is also going to be very critical of how institutional religions, or some pieces of institutional religion, function. And he believes that they're preventing us sometimes from, or encouraging us rather, because it's up to us, he says, to take our teachings from others rather than from the principles directly, doing our own work. And so we'll see that in this sermon. So you could say that, and this is I don't think wrong, but I'm going to use a couple of philosophical terms here. You could say that he has both a metaphysical approach and an ethical approach, and it's not important necessarily to use those terms, but what that means is to have a metaphysical approach means to want to know what things are, or how the world is, or how the universe is. What's true? What's unchanging? What can we discover to be just something undebatable, unchangeable about existence? So he wants to figure this out. I'm not saying that he ever claims to have done this, but the idea is to understand how things are in order to be able to act well, to behave well. So in other words, the behaving or the acting part is where we get into the ethical realm. That is to say, the realm in which we're working with others, where things can be more confusing, where it's not always clear how things are. It's not always clear what one should do. So the metaphysical is the search for how things are so that we'll be able to behave well, or make the right choices, or do the right thing in the ethical realm when we're there among others. So this is an ideal. This is not something that Emerson claims that we always live up to. It's not something that he says is easy to do. And later in his writings, we'll see that he questions whether this is even possible. But that's the idea. So if you know what something is, you can better act on that thing that is. And it kind of makes a really kind of practical sense. I mean, you go into something, if you don't know what you're doing, how are you going to be able to do anything well? So he finds that these two realms are inseparable then, because one cannot rightly act unless one knows how things are. And to know how things are means to be able to learn how they are, and that's where the mind comes in. And that's why human beings are defined or understood by Emerson as being primarily beings who have a capacity to think. They have this capacity. He uses the words capable and capacity everywhere. And they can think. That's what they're able to do, and that's what they're in fact required and have a duty to do. So it's when we stop thinking, or we try not to think, that Emerson is most upset with us. So let's go to the what this thinking is supposed to do specifically, or how one is supposed to use the mind in order to receive and then to act on these principles or the religious instructions. So we need to discover how to best act in order to develop our own particular powers or faculties, which he says on 14 and 15 in a couple of different sections. So these two thinking skills, this ability to sort of receive and then to act, need to be learned or developed, or his word, cultivated. And this is a great word, because it suggests that one needs to work on this stuff. One needs to grow one's abilities, to develop them. And he says on page 14, I'm going to read a passage that says, let's see, let's go to the second full paragraph. About halfway down, there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down. There's a sentence that begins, "The lesson that may be gathered from this scripture, the epigraph, is to value our own souls," again, kind of synonymous with mind, we'll see this, "to have them in such estimation as never to offend them." And this is the theme of the present discourse. This is the theme of what Emerson is saying right now, his present discourse. Discourse meaning a kind of sermon or a lecture. I wish to enforce the doctrine, this is what he's up to, that a man should trust himself. Now, what he means by that is quite specific, and this is what we'll talk about now. Should have a perfect confidence that there's no defect or inferiority in his nature. So he's not born defective. He's born with, as we've seen in the other, or we'll see shortly, potential. He's not born defective. He's born with potential. He's born not inferior. This is different from the Puritan conception of man being born as needing regeneration, as being degenerate, in other words, as not being capable, and understood as not being capable until he or she receives the grace of God and is made capable. So here, man is born with this, as we say, capacity, capability. He's not inferior by nature. And then when he discovers in himself different powers or opinions or matters from others, whom he loves or respects. Now note the whom he loves or respects. When he notices differences among those he respects and loves, and between himself and those he respects and loves, he should not think himself inferior, right? In that degree inferior, but only different. This is really key. So now not everyone. He can think less of others' ideas or think, but those he loves and respects, if they have different opinions, if they have different powers, they are neither inferior nor superior to him. They are simply different. That for every defect, there is probably some compensation provided in his system. Now, this is a lower level defect. So as a whole, every man is born not defective as a whole. Now, we can have within us, and we do all have within us, certain greater and lesser powers, certain faculties that we are more and less good with, or more and less what's the word I'm trying to think of, that we just possess in lesser or greater degrees. So we can have, weak legs but a strong upper body, and therefore we're strong. That's a very simple example, but we're not defective by nature as a whole. We're given we're sort of a package with, capabilities and lesser capabilities that we figure out how to work. We figure out how to work the whole well. So there's compensation in our system. So our system works, but the pieces within it may be of different qualities, and we need to figure out how to make them work so that the system works as well as it can. And any imperfection in our character or in our whole system or in us springs from our neglect to cultivate ourselves, but specifically to cultivate some part of his mind, as he says in that next line. So it's our own failure to cultivate ourselves that may make us defective, in fact. Right? We're not born defective, we can make ourselves defective. How do we make ourselves defective? By not cultivating our mind. Why do we need to cultivate our mind and learn? So that we can know how the world is. Why do we need to know how the world is? So that we'll know best how to act within it. Everything follows from this cultivation of the mind so that one can understand what is, and in this case, in this sentence, what am I made up of? What is my system? What are my strengths and weaknesses? How do I make them work as a whole? Because I am born with a not defective as a whole. All right, so I'm afraid of this great tendency to uniformity of action and conversation among men. This uniformity to him does not make sense. It's not responsible. It doesn't mean that, it suggests that people are not thinking but trying to look to others and mimicking. And the word imitation will come up in the next sentence. I am afraid of the great evil done to so sacred a property as a man's own soul, almost synonymous there with mind, by an imitation arising out of an unthinking admiration of others. Now notice above, he says, those whom he loves and respects, he will look to and he will see how they behave. And they might have opinions or powers different from his, and that's fine. But he loves and respects them, and he understands and appreciates their difference. So we can admire others, But it's unthinking admiration that is the problem. It's unthinking looking to others, unthinking imitation, as he says here, that's the problem. He says, he wraps up this paragraph, I believe God gave to every man the germ of a peculiar character. We have our own character, we have our own constitution, our own system. It is by nature perfect if we decide to make it perfect. It is not defective. We just need to develop its parts and understand it. So if we go down to the bottom paragraph, the last paragraph on page 14, he talks about the consequences of not thinking, of not cultivating one's own powers. And this is quite dangerous for him, especially as a society. He doesn't want us all to be kind of asleep at the wheel. And if you look actually just quickly to the bottom of page 15, right across the book here, the first sentence in the last paragraph reads, now what is it to speak from one's own convictions, to trust yourself? What is it but to keep one's mind ever awake? So this is what he really means by trusting oneself. So keeping the mind awake, always thinking, always paying attention, trying to understand the world and oneself is what it means to trust yourself. And this is opposed to taking from others, simply imitating, simply copying. Now, we're going at times to be like others. That's impossible. It's impossible not to share features with others, to be both different and share some similar features. We're all human in some way. But what's a problem is to simply look to others all the time and try to copy them and be concerned primarily with what they think rather than your own assessment of yourself. Which doesn't mean just love yourself the way you are. It means that you have a lot of work to do. You've got to be, going back to the bottom of page 15, ever awake. Your mind needs to be ever awake. You need to use the senses and the reason, rely on your own birthright of powers, what you've been given by nature, those powers you have, which God bestowed. How little of this virtue enters into conversation. Men speak not from themselves, but from the floating parlance of the time, from the what others are saying, the conversation, the ideas, the temporary trends, the themes of conversation. So, and they think, what is expected to be said? What have others said? What is safest to be said? Instead of what they hold to be true, and they don't listen to themselves. So pay attention to that. This is what he's urging us to do, to trust ourselves. And this is what he will call, on the bottom of page 16, for the first time, self-reliance. And we'll read his famous essay on self-reliance in a couple of weeks. But a lot of the ideas in that essay stem in part from this important early sermon. So to clarify a bit further what he says about this need to trust oneself, I want you to understand that he doesn't mean do whatever you want. This is not at all what he means. Trusting oneself means trusting one's abilities and capacities to understand the way the world is, to know something. It doesn't mean I'm going to be me, I get to do what I want just because. It's got nothing to do with that. So it is not just proclaiming to know everything and saying, I want this. Instead, and as he'll say on page 15 again, keeping the mind ever awake, our duty in so doing is to find out our own share of God's goodness, our God-given powers that must be used to the uttermost, he says. They must be used to the uttermost. So we're given these powers, we're given these capacities. They are to be used. We have to use them for what? Action. For some sort of action in the world. So this isn't our own, this is what the uttermost, that passage I just referred to it's on page 15 at the end of that long paragraph, about halfway down the page. So it says, let him scorn to be a secondary man. We be a primary man. We find out for ourselves. Let him fully trust his own share of God's goodness, that if used to the uttermost, so your own share, What are your faculties? What are your powers? Not what are somebody else's, what are yours? Then you, if used to the uttermost, will lead him to a perfection which has no type yet in the universe, save only in the divine mind. So he will be acting on the God-given part or capabilities that he has in order to be a part of this divine mind, this larger order in the universe. If you recall from Pray Without Ceasing, that all of our ideas originate from God. Ideas that we have originate from this larger force. It's like we're all sort of plucked into the matrix in some way. We're connected to this larger originating force, and our duty is to try to speak that force or use that force, our own particular version of it, as best we can. So there is then, in this sense, just to sum up this lecture, when he says, don't copy others and listen only to yourself, this doesn't mean that we need to be, that we're completely independent. This doesn't mean, as he says at the top of 17, the beginning of the first full paragraph at the top of 17, about 4 lines down the page, he says, a good man, says Solomon, is satisfied from himself. An original man is not an eccentric mind. So an original mind, is not an eccentric mind. Eccentric. It's not outside. It's not off on its own. It's not screaming, I gotta be me, and I don't need anything, and I'm alone, and I'm completely independent. It's in fact, that's not what it means to be an original mind. An original mind goes right to the source. An original mind understands that its ideas come from a primary source, and it finds those ideas on its own. So it originates. An original mind originates. It does the work itself. It has nothing, it doesn't run off, and it does the work itself of finding out the larger way things are, given its God-given portion, its share of the faculties that enable its mind to find out how things are. So it doesn't, it's not off running around screaming, I've got to be me and I don't need anything and my mind is my own in that sense. It's so, to following down that paragraph, to be wholly independent of others' men's judgments does not mean to come under their censure by any extravagance of action. It is only those who are so that can best bear the severe scrutiny of other men's judgments. So we don't want to follow other men's opinions. We want to go right to the source and figure out for ourselves what we think. So if you skip down a little bit further, he says, my friends, let me beseech you to remember that it is only by looking inward that the outward means of knowledge can be made of any avail. We've got to look inward. We've got to begin with ourselves. So the last point I want to make about this idea of self-reliance. Self-reliance then, as he says at the bottom of 16, isn't about running off and proclaiming complete independence from everybody else and from an order in the universe and from, as he still says here, God. It's about doing for yourself and understanding your part within these larger systems and within the world. And in order to do one's part, one must understand one's own capacities and how those capacities serve to complete the whole in some way, the whole of which one is already a part. So it's not to be sort of childish and impish and run away from this. There's a great responsibility in being self-reliant. And just be careful not to equate self-reliance with this running abandon and sort of abandoning responsibilities and not needing anybody. It's quite different, I would say, from that. And we can debate this, but let's look at the bottom of page 16. Let it not be thought, first line in the last paragraph, let it be thought that there is in this self-reliance, this trusting of oneself, that there's not anything of presumption. It's not presumptuous. Not that, like, I gotta be me and I know more than everybody else. It's not that. It's anything inconsistent with a spirit of dependence and piety toward God. So to be self-reliant doesn't mean to be independent and away from God and to reject God. It's the opposite. You are dependent and pious. You respect and have a kind of reverence for this God which provides the order of the universe and gives you your capacities that enable you to understand that order and your part within it. In listening more intently to our own soul, we are not becoming, in the ordinary sense, more selfish. Self-reliance, ideally, as Emerson would have it, is not becoming more selfish in this ordinary sense. It's not that I got to be me and I want what I want, but are departing farther from what is low, moving away from that and falling back upon truth, upon what is, trying to find out what is, and upon God, trying to find out this larger order, or this larger force, or this larger being, perhaps in this line. For the whole value of the soul depends on the fact that it contains a divine principle, that it is a house of God, and the voice of the eternal inhabitant may always be heard within it. All right, so the idea then is that self-reliance is not inconsistent, as he'll say up above on page 14. You can find this, it's the beginning of this second full paragraph on 14. It is important to observe that this self-reliance, which grows out of the scriptural doctrine of the value of the soul, is not inconsistent with our duties to our fellow man or to God. So being self-reliant does not mean rejecting our duties to others. It means making you more, at least as Emerson would have it, it means making you more capable of fulfilling your duties to others because you know exactly what you specifically are able to do. So you know what you're capable of, you know what you're not capable of, and you can honestly, therefore, do the part that you're able to play. Provide what you're able to provide and not try to provide something that you can't, nor run away from doing anything because you say that you're completely independent. So that's the end of this lecture, and we're going to see a lot of these themes again throughout his writings. But remember, the mind working to take in these larger principles, right? To understand these religious principles that tell us, give us instructions, help us to understand how the world is, so that we can then go outward or act and do the best that we can given our particular capacities.